Piece of graffiti on a wall in Pompeii, which roughly translated goes, I wonder that this wall don't split from people writing all this. Well, I can't say that word on television, and until recently I couldn't say it in the movies either. Censorship is something that's always plagued the movies, and its freedom from censorship has only recently and very dearly been won. To ban a book, you have to gather up thousands of copies. You can prevent a play being performed, but not from being quoted. And a song is all but eternal, but take away a film's projection equipment, its theatre, its audience, and it's all but impotent.
Hey, you!
So it seems there's always somebody anxious to tell a filmmaker, you can't say that. Hello, I'm John Baxter. Whether we intend it to be or not, film is a dissident art. It comes with the territory. It has the unique ability to move and communicate with millions of people at the same time. No other art can do that. In its time, it's elected political leaders and brought them down. It's changed our whole way of looking at the world by showing us other lifestyles and encouraging us to emulate them. And it's set up certain individuals, stars, who act as what they now call role models, people we admire and wish to emulate. It's the most dangerous and powerful medium in the history of the world. No wonder the authorities want to ban it.
Immer wenn sie kommt, neues Bier zu zapfen, muss ich meinen Kopf blitzartig unter ihren Rock stecken und sie mit der Zunge befriedigen. Dabei tritt sie mir mit ihren schweren Holzpantinen auf die Hände.
Sexually and socially, movies began in the half-light. Many early films were erotic, if not pornographic. Most were totally disreputable. But by the First World War, America's filmmakers were starting to see that they had a responsibility, and a global responsibility at that. Films flowed from the United States across to Japan, down to Australia, into Russia, and into Europe, where the war was preventing the European studios from making the films that had been Hollywood's main competitors. Also, the filmmakers found that movies had a commercial strength. People who'd seen something in a film very often wanted to buy it. And in fact, in many countries, the local trade representative or ambassador acted also as a film distributor. Markets follow movies, they said. It didn't matter whether they could follow the story or not. Audiences weren't there for the sense of the thing. They cared only for what these people ate, wore, owned, lived in. Just to see paved streets, cars, windows with glass, people with shoes was a form of advertisement. They were hooked on lifestyle, a lifestyle they wanted for themselves. The forces of morality and order didn't worry too much about all this at first, but then along came Mac Sennett. Sennett started out as an actor for D.W. Griffith. Pretty soon he decided audiences wanted something livelier. He moved to California and started a studio called Keystone. There he cranked out one-reel comedies. Usually they dealt with crazy people careering around suburban Los Angeles. Pursuing them was a gang of incompetent policemen, the Keystone Cops. Suddenly there were institutions up there on the screen, not just individuals. The police were being made fun of. So were businessmen and the church. Sennett had a one-line rule for his comedy. The joke of life is the fall of dignity. But if the dignity of a policeman fell in Los Angeles, it encouraged dangerous ideas in Moscow and Berlin as well. Everywhere, Sennett's Keystone cops were banned. The first film's censorship wasn't sexual and moral, it was social and political, and it remains so to this day. Throughout the 60s and into the 70s, Richard Mason was production head of the Australian federal government studio Film Australia. In the late 70s, he decided to make a film of David Ireland's novel, The Unknown Industrial Prisoner.
The novel was brought to my attention, The Unknown Industrial Prisoner, a novel, a story that deals with the relationship between new technology coming into industry, the relationship between workers and that new technology, between workers and unions, between workers and management and overseas control. All the things that at that time, 5 years ago still, of course, but at that time were absolutely critical issues in Australian life. And here was David Ireland's brilliant novel, treating it in a comic, satiric way, ideal for material for a film. And first of all, Ken Cameron, and then we got the script developed, and with Alan Seymour writing the second draft, which is brilliant, and we put it up to the Australian Film Commission. And the Australian Film Commission granted the money and gave us permission to make the film. And then a strange thing happened. Word came down from the new minister, Mr. Bob Ellicott, that asking the Commission to reconsider their decision. So the Film Commission reconsidered their decision, and for the second time, they approved it and said, go ahead, Mason. So we started to cast, we started into final preparation. Then the minister used his right to veto our project, the only time it's ever been done, and he stopped the project.
Richard Mason's experience is from the 70s, but in truth, it could have happened at any time. Censorship isn't a sometime thing. It creeps in on us, sometimes so imperceptibly that we hardly recognise it until it's too late. Michael McLernon is the Australian distributor of some contentious but major films, Fassbinder's Querelle, Robert Van Ackeren's Woman in Flames. One of his main releases of 1985 was L'Homme Blessé, The Wounded Man, by the French director Patrice Chéreau. As usual, McLernon held a press screening of the film. Among those attending was a major critic from one of the larger daily Sydney newspapers. He left the screening saying he was going back to his office to write a review of the film.
Okay, I know what the review was. The review was mixed. It was a good and a bad one. Important for me is that I think it's the responsibility of the press to review it, whether it be good or bad. And in this case, it would have been very helpful for the film. But in the end, the actual critic telephoned me and said, I'm sorry, they refused to publish my critic on the grounds that we're a family newspaper.
Commercial pressure applied against films by newspapers is hardly new. When Orson Welles made Citizen Kane in 1940, there wasn't much doubt that he intended it as a portrait of the millionaire newspaper owner William Randolph Hearst. Hearst, like Kane, lavished millions on a mistress of minor talents, the movie actress Marion Davies. Like Kane, he retired to a gigantic mansion, San Simeon. From there, he gloomed in splendour, ruling his empire of newspapers, radio stations and magazines. News quickly got around of the film's Hearst parallels. One of the subtlest was in the film's first word, rosebud, the one on Kane's lips when he dies. In the film, it's the brand name of a sled, the first thing Kane ever lost. But only a few people knew that rosebud was Hearst's pet word for the blonde genitalia of his mistress.
But 25 years is a long time.
Hearst's pipeline to the movie colony was his film gossip columnist, Luella Parsons. Parsons was an awesome power in Hollywood. Hearst directed her to apply pressure. Long before Citizen Kane was even seen by the public, the Hearst newspapers announced that they would no longer accept any advertising from the producing company, RKO. Luella Parsons barraged the RKO head office, demanding that she be allowed to see the film, that she be allowed to censor the film, that the film be refused release. She even rang Louis B. Mayer, head of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and a sort of industry spokesman. She told him ominously, "Mr. Hearst says, if you boys want private lives, I'll give you private lives." The possibility of the Hearst papers starting a vendetta against Hollywood, exposing its countless scandals, sent a chill through the film community. Citizen Kane did finally get released, but with nothing like the expected splash. One distributor, Spira Skouras, refused to handle it at all. The purpose of cinema, he said, was to entertain people, not to cause trouble. Obviously, newspapers never really change.
I'll have them peanuts. Oh, I have no peanuts.
By 1920, film censorship, social, sexual, political, was entrenched all over the world. In Japan, 1,500 cinemas served a monthly audience of 6 million people, but none of those people were allowed to see kissing, nude statues, what were described as violent scenes, or anything that showed the police in a bad light. Australia had a censor too. In 1920, a film could be banned for any one of a number of reasons. Even after Hollywood had made its films as squeaky clean as it could, there still remained the problem of state censors. Local watch committees and church boards could still cut films after they'd been released from Hollywood. In 1917, an Ohio censor objected to a film of Treasure Island on the grounds that it might encourage children to take up a life under the skull and crossbones. Pennsylvania censors prevented any reference to pregnancy or childbirth in any of their films. Even a scene of a woman sewing baby clothes was cut. All this freelance cutting and banning of films alarmed Hollywood. If anybody was going to censor its films, it was going to be them. But then, a series of scandals that ran through Hollywood in the early 20s involving stars like Fatty Arbuckle and the murder of the director William Desmond Taylor alerted them to the fact that if they weren't going to keep control of their people and their films, the federal government might very well step in and do so. So in 1922, a political fixer called Will H. Hayes was appointed first president of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors Association of America. Hollywood self-censorship was born. You could, however, still get away with a lot if you called it historical. Don Juan, starring Montague Love as Cesare Borgia, was a big hit in 1926. But Australia's censors weren't misled. In the same year, a minister in the Victorian Parliament introduced a new censorship bill with some dire warnings.
Children, go to the picture theatres on Saturday and their brains are filled with a lot of filth which counteracts the good done in the schools. Our members of Parliament are aware that our young boys are from 15 to 17 are attending picture theatres to view young girls dressed in tight, small, short bathing dresses.
Between 1925 and 1927, 2,133 films were imported into Australia. Of those, 243 were banned outright, and 890 were cut, some by as much as 10% of their length. In other words, audiences saw about half of the movies that were sent into Australia to be screened. Film censorship, once begun, is almost impossible to eradicate. In Australia, it very quickly became a fact of life. The same was true in the United States. In 1932, the rules of the Hayes Office were brought together in something called the Production Code. In a much modified form, it continues to exist today. There's something particularly pernicious about the idea of self-censorship. The scripts are vetted before they ever get to the audience. The viewers have no chance to make their opinions felt. The studio knows best. And then there are these rules.
Why is Betty Grable's grass skirt so high? Because navels were not allowed to be exposed on screen. Why are William Powell and Myrna Loy, a married couple in this film, sitting in this uncomfortable position? Because no couple, not even a married one, could be seen in bed unless each had 1 foot on the floor.
Specific phrases and even words were forbidden. Ruben Mamoulian's "Hallelujah, I'm a bum" became
Hallelujah, I'm a tramp.
You couldn't say
God
or
hell.
Instead you said gosh or darn. It was also forbidden to say
God damn.
or
Mother of God.
which is why W.C. Fields said
Godfrey Daniel.
or,
Mother of pearl.
and when particularly vexed,
Sweet spirits of Pomona.
you couldn't say someone was.
Pregnant.
You couldn't refer to
A traveling salesman.
or.
Brass monkeys.
Crime never paid in the movies, not even if it was adultery. Everybody got his or her comeuppance. You couldn't satirize a political party, the police, or the church. As in Russia, censorship had become an instrument of public policy. Censors like to say that they follow community standards. They don't. They form them. It took a long time for the censors to relinquish any of their power, but finally, in the 1930s, they did. A rating system was introduced. Films were graded according to their suitability for young viewers, and it was left to the cinemas to prevent any underage customers from sneaking in. Films were still censored at source, and once again at the point of importation. But after that, it was left to the cinema owners to make sure the law was observed. They hated it. They hate it still.
The distributor of Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde, a violent film for the 60s, was asked, wouldn't it be better to have an adults-only classification so that the film could be released uncut? He said, I'd rather have 15 minutes cut than have to police every cinema and keep out the kids. As for sex, bare breasts were forbidden. So was even a glimpse of pubic hair. Homosexuality simply didn't exist. The most vigorous opponent of censorship was the director of the Sydney Film Festival, David Stratton.
Well, the first thing was publicity, to make the public aware and the press aware of what was happening. Because hitherto there had been absolutely no public knowledge of what the censors were doing. It was really secretive. The censors didn't issue any lists of films that they were cutting or banning, and they were cutting and banning a tremendous amount of films in those days, mid-60s. So the first thing to do was to publicize it. And we announced quite openly that from then on, this was 1966, any cuts demanded by the censors of festival films would be made public. The censors didn't like that, obviously, and they reacted, in my view, by cutting even more than they had before. One of the prime casualties in that year, 1966, was Milos Forman's delightful film Loves of a Blonde, which was decimated with the most idiotic censorship cuts that you could possibly imagine.
Milos Forman was a pretty substantial filmmaker and became more so. He later went to the United States where, among other films, he made the Oscar-winning One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the film adaptation of Hair, and most recently, Amadeus. He's not what you'd really call a pornographer, But the Australian film censor thought otherwise.
There was one major scene in the centre of the film where the blonde of the title and a young pianist go to bed together.
Proč jsi říkal, že jsem hranatá?
Já jsem říkal, že jsi hranatá.
No, ty jsi to říkal.
No, protože jsi hranatá.
Jo, to.
By today's standards, it's a very innocent scene. You don't even see the blonde's breasts. She keeps them decorously covered. But the fact that here were an actor and actress obviously naked, even though you never saw them frontally and you never saw any real sexual activity, just the fact that they were obviously naked was more than enough for the censors of the day. They cut the whole sequence and all the dialogue that went with it, which was actually quite funny. It was a tragedy, I think, because a really superb film was mutilated beyond recognition, and I was furious beyond belief, and I've loathed and despised censors ever since.
By and large, film censors make themselves look ridiculous, however. And the Australian film censor was made to look even more ridiculous in 1969 over a film called I Love, You Love, which was to be shown at the Sydney Film Festival in the presence of the director, the Swedish Stig Bjorkman.
Actually, I believe to this day that the censors, who, to my way of thinking, were not terribly bright, had confused the film with a notorious Swedish film made a couple of years earlier called I'm Curious Yellow. That was a film which everybody knew contained sequences of real lovemaking and had caused a censorship storm and a legal battle in the United States, a battle finally won by the film's distributors. I really think that our censors thought this was that film under another title. But anyway, there was a scene with a pregnant wife and her husband embracing naked, and the censors claimed, again, you couldn't see any sexual activity, but the censors claimed that they were actually making love, even though you couldn't see it. Now, as it happened, the director of the film, Stig Bjorkman, had come to Australia for the festival screening, and he was able to testify that this simply wasn't true. Well, the censors said, in effect, we don't believe you. So he cabled, or telephoned, I forget which, the actor and actress back in Stockholm, and they also testified that it simply wasn't true, that they were actually making love during the scene. But again, the censors said, we don't believe you. We had appealed to the then Minister for Customs, a gentleman called Senator Scott, who noted at the time that the only film he had seen in the last several years was The Sound of Music. He was not the least bit interested in the appeals of the director of the film, and indeed all the publicity that accrued. I remember we went to Canberra to see him personally. I was there with the director of the film. Scott was a tall man. He towered over Stig Bjorkman, and I remember him greeting him with the words, "Well, how are you enjoying Australia?"
David Stratton. Stig Bjorkman could think of only one adequate response to the banning of his film. With the help of some Australian filmmakers, he made a film about it, a gentle comedy called To Australia with Love. It was shown on the last night of that year's festival.
Good afternoon, Australian Customs. Have you anything to declare? Well, anything to declare? Any naughty books? Well, any naughty pictures? Have you got any indecent items? Any pornographic literature? Well, I'll have to look in your luggage. I hope you have a very happy stay in Australia, sir.
The achievements that we ultimately made were thanks to Don Chipp, to whom I will be eternally grateful for his wisdom and his sanity. Chipp had been made, he was a Liberal Party senator. He replaced Senator Scott, who I believe lost his seat actually around about the same time, which seemed to me always poetic justice. But Chipp was appointed Minister for Customs in the Gorton government, and he introduced an R classification, which we had been fighting for a long time, as a way of of actually giving you an adult classification, so this old excuse that you had to cut films to protect children was no longer valid. And he also introduced what really was a gentleman's agreement between the Customs Department and the Censorship Board on the one hand and the festival on the other to enable us to show films uncut.
Superficially, the efforts of anti-censorship campaigners like Stratton have had their effect. We have a rating system. Films are graded from G for general exhibition up through PGR, M, X to R for restricted, and the cinemas are used to policing it. So is there then freedom for film in Australia? Michael McClernand says, decidedly not.
The worst one would, of course, be with a series of films of Lothar Lambert. Lothar Lambert is a director, an underground film director in West Berlin, who is sort of a cross, to give you an idea, is a cross between Andy Warhol and Fassbinder, early Fassbinder. His films are all made for between $10,000 and $15,000, and they deal with all the minorities, homosexuals, drug addicts, and things like that. And with a film, Fräulein Berlin, for example, I got a letter from the censor's office that said that I have to remove 2 minutes of explicit fellatio and also a minute of an erect penis in the film. Now, I know Lothar Lambert, and having seen the film many times, which the public haven't seen, it is not an erect penis, it's a dildo that's shown. For me, it's quite clear it's a dildo. And I contacted the censorship office as to whether I could dispute. I wasn't trying to be smart or funny, but I wanted to dispute that there is a difference between an erect penis and a dildo. And this is now in the process of being disputed.
What effect has our history of censorship had on Australia? Well, it does mean that we can now see films like Van Ackeren's Woman in Flames without a dirty raincoat in our lap. But why don't our filmmakers attack the same kind of contentious subjects with the freedom of the German, the French, the British? I believe that it's made us as a nation more cautious, more nervous, less inclined to deal with the difficult, the complex, the contentious. Once the weight of authority has descended on an artist, it remains forever a potentiality in his or her mind. If you cut us, we bleed alone. If you cut a film, everyone bleeds.